She had 72 hours to save everything her father had ever built, and the only man who could help her was the one person in the city no one dared ask for anything. Nari Yoon found out on a Tuesday. She had been in the middle of a deposition, 3 floors above the Chicago River, when her phone vibrated against the glass conference table. She ignored it the first time. The second time, she pressed it face down without looking. The third time, she saw her uncle's name on the screen and felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She excused herself with the kind of calm that comes only from years of practice, the same calm she used in front of hostile witnesses, in front of judges who'd already made up their minds, in front of clients who cried and expected her not to. She walked to the hallway, pressed the phone to her ear, and listened. By the time her uncle finished speaking, she was gripping the wall with her free hand. Yoon Architecture, her father's firm. 31 years of work, of blueprints and buildings, and a man who believed that the spaces people lived in could change how they felt about being alive. It was being absorbed, not dissolved. Absorbed, which was somehow worse, because it meant everything her father had built would continue to exist under someone else's name, with someone else's vision, and every trace of who he had been would be quietly erased. Marcus Hale had been buying up minority shares for 8 months, quietly, methodically, the way a flood moves before anyone notices the water rising. Now he held 37%. He had made an offer to the remaining partners, an offer that expired in 72 hours, and 2 of them were already prepared to sign. "Can we fight it?" her uncle asked. Nari pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. She was a litigator. She knew contracts the way other people knew the backs of their hands. She already knew the answer before she finished thinking through it. "Not in 72 hours, she said. "Not through the courts." There was a silence on the line that felt like a held breath. "Then what do we do?" She opened her eyes. The Chicago River caught the afternoon light below her, silver and indifferent. "I'll figure it out," she said. She always did. That was the thing about Nari. She had been figuring things out since she was 19 years old, and her mother got sick, and her father kept working because stopping would have broken him, and someone had to hold the pieces together. She had put herself through law school on a combination of scholarships and sheer stubbornness. She had made partner at 30. She had never once asked for help that she hadn't already tried to solve herself first. But she had never faced anything like Marcus Hale. He wasn't just an investor, he was a consolidator, a man who acquired struggling creative firms and turned them into profitable, soulless machines. He had done it to an architecture firm in Boston, a design studio in Portland, a literary agency in San Francisco. He bought them, rebranded them, and extracted every last drop of what made them distinctive until all that remained was the corporate shell. She spent the rest of that afternoon in her office, going through every legal avenue she could find. She called 2 colleagues who specialized in M&A. She read the partnership agreement her father had filed in 1993, line by line, looking for leverage that wasn't there. She ate nothing. She drank 3 cups of coffee that went cold on her desk. By 9 o'clock that night, she had one name left. She stared at it on the notepad in front of her like it might change if she looked long enough. Cade Seo. She had heard the name her entire professional life. Everyone in Chicago's business world had. SEO Global Ventures operated in the space between private equity and something harder to define. A firm that moved fast, took calculated risks, and had a track record of making other powerful people's problems disappear, usually by becoming more powerful than the problem itself. Cade Seo had blocked 3 hostile takeovers in the last 5 years. He had done it quietly. He had done it completely. What she also knew, what her uncle had told her tonight, voice low, as though the information itself was fragile, was that Cade Seo had known her father, not as a business associate, as something more. Her father had helped Seo Global Ventures during its early years, a detail so buried in her family's history that she'd never heard it spoken aloud until tonight. Her uncle wasn't sure of the details. He only knew that her father had called in a favor once, and that Seo had delivered, and that the debt, if there was one remaining, might be the only card she had left to play. Nari looked at the name on the notepad for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called his office. She expected a voicemail. It was 9:15 on a Tuesday evening. What she did not expect was for someone to answer on the second ring. A woman, efficient and utterly unsurprised by the hour, who took Nari's name and put her on hold without a word of explanation. She waited 4 minutes. Then a different voice came on the line, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had never needed to raise itself to be heard. "Ms. Yoon," he said, not a question. She straightened in her chair without thinking. "Mr. Seo, I apologize for the hour. You wouldn't be calling at this hour if it weren't urgent." A pause that somehow didn't feel like hesitation. "My office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. The line went quiet before she could respond. She held the phone for a moment, then set it down on the desk. She had spoken to CEOs, senior partners, federal judges. She had never had someone communicate so much with so few words. She wasn't sure if it should impress her or unsettle her. It did both. The CO Global offices occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Wacker Drive that seemed to exist in a different atmospheric layer than the rest of the city, quieter, colder, with a quality of light that felt curated rather than natural. The lobby was all pale stone and glass, and the people who moved through it walked the way people walk when they've spent enough time around someone powerful that it's altered their baseline. Nari arrived at 8:55. She wore the charcoal suit she wore to federal court, fitted, precise, unambiguous. She had slept 4 hours and looked like she'd slept 8, because she had learned long ago that the appearance of composure was often more useful than composure itself. She noticed the shift in the room before she saw him. It was subtle. A receptionist who had been mid-conversation simply stopped. An assistant near the elevator adjusted his posture without seeming to realize he'd done it. The low hum of ambient conversation dropped by half. And then Cade Seo walked through the glass doors at the far end of the lobby. He moved without urgency, each step deliberate, contained, like a man who had never needed to hurry because the world had always waited for him. He wore a dark suit that fit with the precision of something made specifically for his frame, and he carried nothing in his hands, which somehow made him look more formidable than if he'd been carrying a briefcase. He was tall. His jaw was set in a way that suggested it was almost always set that way, and there was a faint scar along the left side of it. Thin, old, the kind that told a story by refusing to explain itself. His eyes found her immediately. They were dark, and they held the particular quality of someone who assessed things quickly and completely, and then stopped showing that he'd assessed anything at all. He didn't smile. "Ms. Yoon." He stopped 3 feet in front of her. Up close he was more imposing and somehow less readable. "Follow me." 2 words, no greeting, no handshake offered. He was already turning toward the elevator before she had a chance to respond. She followed. The conference room he led her to had floor-to-ceiling windows facing Lake Michigan. The water was steel gray that morning, restless, beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they also suggest danger. He gestured toward the chair across from his and sat down at the head of the table in a single fluid motion. "Tell me about Marcus Hale," he said. She told him. All of it, cleanly and without editorializing, because she had learned that the best way to earn serious people's attention was to give them information without decoration. She laid out the timeline, the share structure, the partnership agreement, the expiration of the offer. She told him what she'd already tried and why it hadn't worked. He listened with complete stillness. He didn't take notes. He didn't interrupt. He watched her the way someone watches something they're deciding the full value of, and it was not comfortable to be watched that way, but she didn't look away. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Hale's acquisition falls apart if he loses the confidence of his financing partner," Cade said. "A Singapore-based fund called Meridian Capital. They've been looking for a reason to exit 3 of his projects." He paused. "I can give them that reason within 48 hours. Nari felt the specific relief of someone who has been bracing for impact and instead found solid ground. She didn't let it show on her face. "What do you need from me?" she asked. He looked at her. "I'm being considered for a federal infrastructure contract," he said. "The selection committee has 8 members. 3 of them have publicly stated concerns about my firm's culture, specifically that I operate in isolation, that there is no indication of stability or long-term judgment beyond my professional record." He paused, and something in his expression shifted by a fraction, not softening exactly, but changing register. "The committee makes its decision in 60 days. They are looking for evidence that the person running this firm has something worth protecting outside of it." The room was very quiet. Nari understood what he was saying before he finished saying it. "You need a partner," she said. "Someone visible, someone credible, someone who cannot be easily connected to my firm as a professional interest." His voice carried no apology, no seduction, no manipulation. It was exactly what it was. "You would accompany me to 4 scheduled events over 60 days. You would be introduced as someone I am involved with. You would not need to explain or perform beyond being present. And in exchange, Hale's deal collapses. Your father's firm remains intact." She looked at him. The lake moved behind him, grey and vast. She thought about what she was being asked to trade. 60 days, 4 appearances, the inconvenience of proximity to a man she didn't know, against 31 years of her father's life's work. "2 conditions," she said. He waited. "This ends the moment I decide it does," she said. "Not when the 60 days expire, the moment I say it's over." Something moved through his eyes. Not surprise, assessment. "And the second?" "Whatever we say in rooms like this one, she said, is the truth. I don't want a script. I want to know enough about you that I can speak about you naturally. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it well." He held her gaze for what felt like longer than it was. "Agreed," he said. He slid a single document across the table. It was brief, a page and a half. She read every line. She picked up the pen, looked at the top of the document once more, and signed. He signed beneath her name without ceremony. When she set the pen down, she had the sensation that the room was slightly different than it had been 30 seconds ago. Like a door had opened somewhere, and the air pressure had changed. "I'll have my team contact yours about Hale within 24 hours, and he said, standing. He buttoned his jacket with one precise motion. "The first event is in 2 weeks, a gala at the Cultural Center. My assistant will send the details." "Understood," she said. He was already moving toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning around. "Ms. Yoon," he said, "for the firm your father built, the Carlisle Bridge Commission 2004. It won a National Design Award." She stared at his back. "I know," she said carefully. He said nothing else. He walked out. She stayed at the conference table for a moment, looking at the lake. She had been in negotiations her entire professional life. She knew how to read rooms, how to read people, how to find the space between what someone said and what they meant. She had no idea what to make of Cade Seo. Marcus Hale's financing partner withdrew from the deal within 36 hours. Nari heard about it through her uncle, who called her Thursday morning with a voice that sounded like he'd been crying, except that her uncle never cried, so she decided she hadn't heard that. "How?" he kept asking. "It doesn't matter how," she said. What mattered was that the offer had expired, that the 2 partners who had been ready to sign had reversed course once it became clear that Hale no longer had the capital to follow through. That Yoon architecture was still Yoon architecture. She called Cade's office to confirm she was still prepared to honor her side of the agreement. His assistant, whose name was Priya and who communicated entirely in crisp, friendly efficiency, confirmed that he was aware and that the first event remained on schedule. The 2 weeks before the gala passed in a way that felt both ordinary and suspended, like the period before a trial begins when everything is preparation and nothing is yet real. Priya sent her a detailed brief about the event, the guests who would be present, the specific committee members who would be in attendance, and a single handwritten note from Cade himself that contained 3 lines. "You'll be asked how we met. The truth is preferable to invention. Tell them I called you, that part is accurate." She read it twice. She wasn't sure if it was thoughtful or simply tactical. She was starting to think that with Cade Seo, the 2 were not always separable. The night of the gala, she wore a dress the color of deep water, midnight blue, simple in cut, precise in the way that simplicity sometimes requires more craft than decoration. She arrived at the Cultural Center at 7:15, and saw him waiting on the steps outside, which surprised her. She had expected to be escorted up. She had not expected him to simply be there, standing apart from the other guests, watching the street with the particular quality of someone who is always on some level, waiting for something. He turned when she stepped out of the car. For a brief moment, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, something shifted in his expression. It was gone before she could name it. "You're on time," he said. "I'm always on time," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, the suggestion of one quickly contained. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked inside. The gala was everything such events always were. Tall rooms full of important people, performing versions of themselves for each other. The music pitched just loud enough to discourage real conversation and just soft enough to encourage the illusion of it. Nari had been to 100 events like this in her professional life. She knew how to move through them. What she hadn't anticipated was how different it felt to move through one next to Cade Seo. The space around him was different. It wasn't just that people noticed him. They reoriented. Conversations adjusted. Men who ran companies extended their hands with the specific energy of people hoping to be remembered. And through all of it, Cade moved with the same contained, unhurried quality she had noticed in his lobby, acknowledging people with a nod or a brief word, and then returning his attention to her in a way that felt, and she recognized that it was performance, it was the point, it was the arrangement. But still, it felt like being the fixed point in a moving room. A committee member named Aldridge found them near the bar. He was in his 60s, amiable in the practiced way of career bureaucrats, and he looked at her with the benign assessment of someone taking measurements. "So you're the reason Cade has been harder to reach than usual," he said pleasantly. "I doubt that," she said. "I think he's simply always difficult to reach." Aldridge laughed. Cade's hand found the small of her back. A brief pressure, there and then gone, but enough that she was aware of it for the next 10 minutes. Later, crossing the room between conversations, he leaned slightly toward her and said, low enough that only she could hear, "You handled Aldridge well." "I handled him the way I handle witnesses," she said. "Is that what I am?" She glanced up at him. "You're a deponent, slightly different." He looked at her for a moment, that unreadable quality, and then something beneath it, brief, warm, carefully covered. "Fair," he said. The 60 days did not feel like 60 days. They felt in the strange compression that happens when your life reorganizes around a new fixed point, like both longer and shorter than that. Like a season that shifts before you've finished adjusting to the one before it. There were 4 events. Then, because the situation required it, a 5th, a dinner with 2 of the committee members and their partners, intimate and unavoidable, held at a restaurant where the tables were far enough apart that performance became conversation, became something harder to classify. In between, there were things she hadn't anticipated in the agreement. Priya calling to ask her preferences about food allergies before an event. A car arriving to take her to a deposition she'd mentioned offhandedly, because Cade had apparently noted that her usual firm driver was unavailable that day and arranged it without saying anything. Small things, things that could be written off as logistics, as the efficient maintenance of a working arrangement. She wrote them off. She tried. There was also conflict of the kind she had not expected. The 3rd event was a benefit concert, the kind where donors gathered in a private venue, and the atmosphere was carefully engineered to feel relaxed, which meant it was in fact more precisely controlled than anything with an explicit agenda. A man named Julian Park, whom she knew professionally as a senior partner at a competing firm, made his way to her twice in the span of an hour. He was charming, attentive, carrying the specific energy of someone who had noticed her before tonight and was using tonight as an excuse. She was gracious and disinterested and entirely professional. She noticed later that Cade had seen both interactions. He said nothing for the rest of the evening. He was, if possible, more contained than usual, conversation precise, attention complete, nothing to indicate anything was different. But his jaw carried a new tension that she recognized the way you recognize weather changes before you can name them. In the car on the way back, the silence was the specific kind that has texture. "Julian Park is a colleague," she said. without looking away from the window. "I know who he is," Cade said. "Then you know there's nothing to note." A pause. "I didn't say there was." "You didn't need to." Another pause. Longer. "He was watching you," Cade said. His voice was flat, controlled. The control, she was realizing, was the tell. The more controlled he was, the less controlled something beneath it had become. She turned to look at him. In the passing light of the street, his profile was sharp and still. "Cade," she said carefully, "what exactly are you concerned about?" He looked forward. His jaw worked once. "The arrangement requires a degree of credibility," he said. "Outside associations complicate that." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that what this is about?" she said. He didn't answer. She turned back to the window, but she didn't dismiss what she'd seen. She filed it away in the way that lawyers and perceptive people file things, carefully, without conclusion, to be retrieved later. The fourth week was when the arrangement started to become something she couldn't categorize as cleanly as she needed to. It happened incrementally. A dinner at his apartment, arranged for a committee member who prized informality, where she discovered, entirely by accident, that he cooked. Not as a performance of domesticity, but with the same focused, efficient quality he brought to everything. And she sat on the far side of the kitchen island and watched him work and felt something she'd been careful to keep at a comfortable distance, inch closer. He was different in his apartment, not soft exactly. She didn't think Cade Seo had a soft register, or if he did, she hadn't found it. But less curated. He rolled up his sleeves. He made a dry comment about the committee member's known preference for overcooked fish. He poured her a glass of wine and set it on the counter without looking at her, and she found herself thinking that this was what it would look like if this were real. And then she stopped thinking that. The committee member left at 9:30. The apartment went quiet in the particular way of spaces that are large enough to absorb silence, without amplifying it. She was gathering her coat when he said, without turning from the window where he'd been standing, "You mentioned your father's firm was having trouble with its project timeline." She paused. "In passing." "Vandenberg Construction," he said. "They've been slow on 2 other projects this year. I have a contact who can put pressure on them to prioritize." He paused. "Professionally speaking, it falls within the arrangement." She looked at his back. The city lay behind the glass in its nighttime version, all distance and light. "It doesn't fall within the arrangement," she said. He was quiet. "It's outside the scope," she said, her voice even. "The arrangement is about the contract and the gala events. This is—" She paused. "This is something else." He turned from the window. His expression was, as always, composed, but there was something in his eyes that he hadn't, in that moment, thought to close off. "Consider it goodwill, he said. She held his gaze. "You don't do goodwill." Something moved across his face. Not quite a wince, the muscular equivalent of a wince expressed entirely in the jaw. "No," he said, "I don't." She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. "Cade," she said. She didn't turn around. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, "for the dinner. It was good." She left before he could respond. Outside, waiting for her car, she stood in the cold October air and did something she almost never did. She allowed herself to feel something completely, without immediately translating it into strategy or decision. She thought about the way he'd stood at the window, the way he'd offered something he didn't have a contractual reason to offer, and then retreated from it almost immediately, as though he'd startled himself. She thought about the scar on his jaw, the way he adjusted his cufflinks before difficult conversations, the way he was never, not once, unkind, and how that quiet refusal to be unkind was somehow more striking than any grand gesture, because it cost him something in a world where coldness was armor and warmth was exposure. She got into the car and told herself this was manageable. She was not sure she believed herself. The complication arrived in the form of a woman named Celeste Juan, and she arrived at the worst possible time. Celeste was a former associate of Cade's, not romantically, Nari would eventually understand, but professionally. and with the particular intensity of a shared history that hadn't ended cleanly. She appeared at the fifth dinner as a guest of the committee member's wife, and she was beautiful in the deliberate way of someone who had learned to use beauty as a tool. She spent 20 minutes near Cade with the specific ease of someone reminding everyone present, including herself, that she had known him before, whatever this was. Nari watched from across the table and felt something cold and sharp move through her chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She recognized the feeling immediately, and with a clarity that was deeply unwelcome. She was not performing anything. That was the problem. The evening ended without incident. In the car, Cade was once again contained in that particular way. And then he said out of nowhere in the dark, "Celeste was a business partner for 2 years. We ended the partnership because she wanted to merge the firms, and I refused." He paused. There was nothing else. Nari looked at him. "I didn't ask," she said. "I know," he said. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. The weeks that followed moved differently. The professional arrangement was nearing its end. Day 48, then 52, then 56. The committee was expected to announce within the week. There was no structural reason for the arrangement to continue. There was every reason, practically speaking, for it to conclude cleanly and professionally, as they had both agreed it would. Nari knew this. She went to work. She won a motion she'd been fighting for 6 weeks. She had dinner with her uncle and looked at the framed architectural drawings her father had done for a building in Hyde Park, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that she hadn't lost something that couldn't be recovered. On day 58, she worked late. She fell asleep at her desk somewhere around 2 in the morning, which she almost never did. She was disciplined about sleep, about the maintenance of herself the way she was disciplined about everything else. But the deposition prep had gone long, and the silence of the empty office was, for once, easier to stay inside than to leave. She woke at 3:15. The office was dark except for the lamp on her desk. For a moment, she wasn't entirely sure what had woken her. Then she heard it, the quiet sound of the door to the small side hallway opening and closing, and then silence. She stood. She straightened her jacket. She walked to the hallway and opened the door. The hallway was empty, except there was a takeout bag on the floor outside the door. A specific bag, from a specific restaurant on Michigan Avenue that she had mentioned in passing, on their first dinner, as the only place in the city that made doenjang jjigae the way her mother used to. She had not thought anything of mentioning it. She had not thought she'd been noted. She picked up the bag. Inside, still warm, was exactly that. And beneath the bag, a single line written on a notepad page in his handwriting, minimal, unhesitating, the handwriting of someone who rarely revised. "You should eat something. You work too late." She stood in the empty hallway for a long moment. Then she sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and ate the soup in the silence of the building at 3 in the morning. And she let herself cry a little, not from sadness, but from the specific overwhelm of being known when you'd spent a very long time making sure you weren't legible to anyone, because if no one could read you, then no one could edit you. And it was very efficient, but it was also, she was understanding now, extremely lonely. She didn't know that he was still in the building. He had come in on a pretext, something his assistant had flagged as needing his attention, though Priya would later be entirely unable to remember what that had been. He had seen the light under her office door. He had left the bag and turned to go. He made it to the elevator. He stood in front of the closed elevator doors for approximately 90 seconds. Then he went back. He stopped at the hallway entrance. The door was ajar, and through it he could see her, on the floor, coat off, heels on the tile beside her, eating from the bag with the container balanced on her knees. Her hair was down, which he had not seen before. Her expression was the expression of someone who had stopped performing for the night. She hadn't cried in a way that showed. She was already composed. She was always composed. But there was something in the angle of her shoulders, a fractional softness, a release of something that was usually held so precisely that you couldn't see it was being held, that he had never seen before, and that he found he could not stop looking at. He must have made a sound. She looked up. For a moment, neither of them moved. He was still in his suit. It was past 3 in the morning. He had no reason to be in this building. They both knew this. He looked at her on the floor. She looked at him in the doorway. His jaw tightened. She watched it happen. He didn't move. She didn't ask him to explain. "There's enough for two," she said and held up the container. He looked at it. He looked at her. He walked down the hallway, took off his jacket, folded it over his arm and sat down on the floor beside her. They ate in silence. The building breathed around them. The city went on being the city somewhere far below. At some point, their shoulders were touching. Neither of them moved away. The committee announcement came on day 61. SEO Global Ventures was awarded the contract. The press release used words like demonstrated stability and long-term leadership capacity and evidence of personal and professional integrity. And Nari read it in her office and felt something that was pride, she thought, except that pride didn't usually feel quite this complicated. She expected to hear from him directly. She spent the morning waiting for a call that didn't come. In the afternoon, she drafted a brief note, professional, clear, concluding the arrangement as they had agreed, wishing him well on the contract. She reread it 3 times. She was about to send it when her phone rang. Cade. "I saw the announcement," she said. "Yes," he said. A silence. Not uncomfortable. Or uncomfortable in the particular way that things are uncomfortable when they are full of something that needs to be said. "The arrangement is concluded," she said carefully, "by its terms." "I know," he said. Another silence. "Nari." His voice was different. She had never heard her name in his voice before. He almost never used it. And the difference was significant in a way that made it difficult to keep her expression neutral, even though he couldn't see her face. "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I called you that Tuesday night because Priya flagged your name," he said. "Your professional history. The Yoon architecture connection." He paused. "I told myself it was strategic, that the committee timing aligned with your situation and the arrangement made operational sense." She was very still. "I told myself that for approximately the first week," he said. The silence that followed had weight and shape. It moved in the room. "This was supposed to be a contract," he said, and his voice was lower than she had ever heard it. Not quiet in the controlled way, but quiet in the way of something said by someone who has stopped managing their voice. "It was never supposed to be you." She closed her eyes. She held the phone against her ear. "Cade," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she decided she didn't care. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't," she said. "I'm choosing to." She paused. "I was very certain for approximately the first 3 weeks that I was doing a job, that I knew exactly what this was. And then? And then I found soup on the floor of my hallway at 3 in the morning," she said, "from the only restaurant in the city that makes it the way my mother did. And you sat on the floor in a $3,000 suit and didn't say a word about it, and I stopped being certain." A very long silence. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "The personal part. I have managed to avoid it with considerable efficiency for a long time." "I know," she said. "I've noticed. I would like to try to do it less efficiently," he said. If you're Cade," she said gently. "Yes." He exhaled. It was small and barely audible, and the most purely human sound she had ever heard from him. They met that evening at the restaurant on Michigan Avenue. Not for a committee dinner, not for an appearance. Just the two of them at a corner table, in a city that went about its ordinary October business outside the window. He was already there when she arrived. He stood when he saw her, an automatic motion, unrehearsed, the kind of thing that comes from how someone was raised and not from strategy. She sat down across from him. "The contract," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket. She had not expected this. He produced, folded in thirds, the page and a half they had signed 58 days ago in his conference room above the river. He placed it on the table between them. He produced a lighter. She raised an eyebrow. "We're in a restaurant," she said. "The ashtray is on the table," he said. "It's a permissive city." She looked at the contract. She looked at him. She picked it up, held one corner to the lighter, and set it in the ashtray between them. They watched it burn down to the edges and go still. "Concluded," she said. Concluded, he agreed. And then, with the careful precision of someone doing something they rarely do, he smiled. Not the fractional suggestion of one she had seen in the lobby 8 weeks ago. An actual smile, fully present, directed at her. It was, as advertised, deeply disorienting. You should do that less sparingly, and she said. It's effective. I've been told, he said, that I'm extremely effective. She laughed, genuinely, unguarded, the laugh that came out when she wasn't monitoring it. He watched her laugh with the expression of someone encountering a thing they've been waiting for, without knowing they'd been waiting. The food came. The city moved beyond the window. They talked for 3 hours and then longer, and when they finally walked out into the night, the air was cold and clear, and she took his arm the way she had at the gala, except that there was no committee, no arrangement, no version of this that was anything other than what it was. He was quiet for a block. Then he said, "The building your father designed on Hyde Park. I've driven past it." She looked up at him. The streetlights caught the scar on his jaw. "He would have liked you," she said. He respected people who moved through the world without making excuses for it. Cade said nothing for a moment. His arm was solid beneath her hand. "He told me once," he said quietly, "that architecture was about trust. That you build for people who will never meet you, and you have to trust that what you make will hold." He paused. I was 24. I was not a person who used that word easily. She stopped walking. He stopped with her. She looked at him in the orange light of the street. This man who commanded boardrooms and sat on the floor of empty hallways and learned the name of a restaurant from a sentence she'd said in passing and had never, not once, been anything but exactly what he was. "You knew him," she said softly, "not just professionally." "He was kind to me," he said, "when I didn't have anyone else who was." He said it simply, the way he said everything, with no performance, no appeal for sympathy, just the fact of it. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached up, put her hand against his jaw, the left side, the side with the scar, and stood on her toes and kissed him. Not with urgency, not with the accumulated pressure of 60 days, but with the specific tenderness of something chosen freely, which is the only kind of tenderness that costs anything. He went still for one breath, as though registering it. Then his hands found her, and he kissed her back with the same focused, unhurried quality he brought to everything, as though there was nothing in the city more worth his complete attention than this exact moment. When they separated, the night was cold and entirely quiet. His hand stayed at her waist. Her hand stayed at his jaw. "Nari," he said, in that voice she had decided she was going to hear for a long time. "I know," she said. She had signed the contract to save her father's firm, to protect the buildings and the blueprints, and the 31 years of a man who believed that the spaces people lived in could change how they felt about being alive. She had never expected to discover in the process that she had been right about that a space could change you, that proximity to something real, sustained long enough, had a way of making real things visible that had always been there. She had never expected to find, in the coldest man she'd ever known, someone who had learned the word trust from her father and spent 15 years proving it. She had never expected to find, in him, something that felt like home. But here they were, and the city held them, and the night held them, and it was enough.